Welcome to the Kingsburg Community Church podcast, Thinking About Faith. We pray that this podcast helps you deepen your faith in God and stir some inner thoughts about the Christian life.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the KCC podcast, Talking About Faith. This is Pastor Ed, and I hope you're having a great week and that you're finding our podcast interesting and helpful as you seek to live a life that is consistent with the gospel. How do you describe yourself when you're introduced to someone new? Do you start with your career, your job? Do you start with your relationships? That you're a dad or a mom or a brother or a grandparent? Do you start with your nationality, or do you start with your political views? We live in a cultural moment where some people believe that the most important thing about you is your identity. So people talk about identity categories like race, political allegiance, gender, education, and also what generation they belong to. This is a strange thing for me in our cultural moment, because I grew up in a time when we were trying to break down the differences between people and just see people as people instead of dividing up into smaller groups. I find it a little dismaying that people will categorize people negatively by their, you're of the oppressor race and you're of the oppressed race, or pitting, you can't understand what it's like to be a woman because you're a man, those sorts of things. I find it a little disturbing and a source of a lot of unhealthy disunity in our country. Biblical Christians believe that our identity as followers of Jesus Christ makes all other identity categories almost unimportant. Paul says in Galatians 3:28, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." It's not as if the other categories are not important, but they're just much less important than our identity as followers of Jesus Christ. If the most important thing about me is my identity as a follower of Jesus, then it follows that the story of how I came to become a follower of Jesus is very important if I want you to really know who I am and what matters to me most. That story, which I call my faith story, as well as the story of significant points of decision or of awakening in my faith, is essential to really explaining who I am. And today, I want to encourage you to go to the effort to record your faith story and to share it with others, especially your kids, your grandkids, and other people in your family. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." Peter says we should be prepared to answer why we have this hope inside, how we came to be followers of Jesus Christ, and to do that in a way that is gentle and respectful. Give the reason for the hope you have. Why did you make that decision to follow Jesus even when so many others turned away? Or maybe you grew up in the church, so coming to Christ wasn't the big thing, but staying a Christian when you went away to a secular college or moved away from your youth group, that was the thing that was the challenge for you. Why did you come to Jesus when so many were skeptics? What convinced you to trust him and to follow him? There were lots of other options. There are lots of other faith systems, all claiming to be right. And then, of course, we live in this day in a very secular culture where probably the easiest thing to do is to just shrug our shoulders and say, well, I don't know. That there are all these different religions, so I'm just not going to be anything. I'm just not going to even think about it. It's been my experience that the power of a personal story is much more likely to persuade another person to consider seeking God than any theological lecture or any biblical argument. Theological lectures and biblical arguments are great for people who are already seeking God or are already following Jesus. But for those who are on the outside, who aren't interested, that which is likely to pique their imagination is a story. There was an old song when I was young, and one of its verses was, I'm not one who's got it all in place, telling you what you should do. No, I'm just one old hungry beggar showing you where I found food. And that really is what our faith story is about. I'm not trying to convince you that I'm better than you because I'm a follower of Christ. In fact, I'm a follower of Christ because I am a sinner and a broken person. Because although I want everybody to think I'm a winner, I'm not. I'm a loser, and I can't save myself. And when I was most spiritually hungry, I found a place where there was the bread of heaven, and I was satisfied. And other people who are seeking, who are hungry spiritually, they need that food too. And I'm not the one who's offering the food. I'm not the one who's baking the bread. I'm just the one saying, hey, I tried. I knocked on this door. The door opened, and I got food. And maybe if you were to do that as well, you would find food as well. Even if you never share your story with another person, I think there's tremendous value in just the exercise in taking time to look back to see how God has been active in your life and to thank him for those moments of joy and faith where God broke through, where God showed you that he was real. David asks God to restore to me the joy of your salvation. And I like to remember over and over again those times in my life, whether it was, I remember sitting in an outdoor chapel in the Redwoods once with my guitar, just singing praise to God. And it seemed like his presence was so close to me, and it just stamped itself on me, and all the anxiety and the burden and the brokenness and loneliness that I had carried throughout my entire life, it just seemed to fall away. And there was a level of peace and joy that truly passed human understanding. And I like to remember that moment. I was already a Christian, but I like to remember that moment when the storms are raging, because that was a moment of peace. And it reminds me that there's a peaceful place in the eye of the storm. And I've experienced it before, and God will surely bring me to that place this time as well. If you remember those times and give thanks for that moment when salvation came to you, or when God showed up in a powerful way, it's very, very encouraging. Those God moments in our lives are encouraging for the rest of our lives, aren't they? Because usually we are tempted to feel like our current trial, that thing we're facing next, is the worst thing we'll ever face. And that's rarely true. Remember how David was facing the giant Goliath? And he remembered back to how God had delivered him already from a mountain lion and from a bear. And he said, the God who delivered me said to the Philistine, the giant, Goliath, he said to him, the God who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear is going to deliver me from you, giant, so look out. And David was supremely confident in the face of this great Philistine warrior. When we look back at the path that God has delivered us many times from dangers, we can draw confidence that he has not abandoned us today as we face the next giant in our path. There's always a giant in our path. And so remembering those things, taking the time to write it down and to remember, that can be a wonderful thing to read through from time to time to say, God has been there. He's been so good to me for so many years. I can certainly trust him for the future. As I said, though, I think the greatest legacy that you can leave, particularly to your family, your children, your grandchildren, but as well to your Christian friends, is to take them through your journey when you decided to follow Jesus. Our kids can assume that we have never had struggles of doubt in our faith, that we never had moments of wandering away. Or they think that they are so different from us and their world is so different from us that our story really doesn't have anything to say to them. However, it's not true. Human beings haven't changed throughout the course of human history. Even our struggles, our failures, our doubts, and our heartbreaks can serve to describe a living, real-world faith that shows how Jesus helps us through the challenges of life. It's that moment when our kids realize, wait a minute, you struggled through the same things that I'm struggling with, and Jesus was there for you. Maybe I ought to give him a chance. And of course, it's not just our kids who can benefit. Perhaps there's someone else who might be encouraged to put their faith in Jesus just by hearing your story. Evangelism is hard in our current world. Becky Pippert, who did evangelism for Campus Crusade, wrote a book, and she said long ago, the one thing that believers and non-believers agree on is they both dislike evangelism. And that is true. Non-believers don't want to be bothered by hearing your faith story, usually. And you are probably very reluctant to share your faith story because you don't want to offend anybody or have somebody get angry with you or break a relationship. It's weird, isn't it? Because it seems to be acceptable to talk about any other deeply personal thing in the world in which we live. I can't tell you the number of people who want to get in my face and tell me their political opinion when I'm not really interested, and it has the potential to push us apart. I don't know why they would want to do that. Others who come and impose their lifestyle opinion on other people, kind of, saying without words, accept me as I am, or you're a hater, or something like that. And so people are totally willing to expose deep things about their lives. But when it comes to faith sharing, it usually takes developing a long relationship before someone is even willing to listen to your life story. And you've got to be ready at that moment. I've noticed that when someone is hurting or facing a crisis, they're much less likely to become offended when you share something of your life where God has helped you through. If the ship goes down and somebody's paddling along in the ocean, and a rescue boat comes up, nobody asks, well, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Because I'm not going to get in your boat if you're of the other party. Or what's your view on climate change or something, whatever, all the things that people base their identity on. All they're going to care about is there's a boat and I will be saved if I swim over to the boat and get pulled out. And so people at that time often are willing to consider. I've never ever had a person say, no, please don't pray for me. If I've asked them, can I pray for you? Particularly if there's something in your life where God helped you through, sharing that can be encouraging to them, and usually the defenses are down at that time. Not always, but usually. Perhaps God even allows you to carry your wounds in order to reach others who get wounded. We always, when we're wounded, God, why am I wounded? Why did you allow me to collect these wounds? Why didn't you take the wounds away? Perhaps building a bridge to other wounded, people get wounded in this world. Perhaps that's why God has allowed you to carry those wounds. I know that those of you who have lost a child have a special word of comfort to others who share the same heartbreak. And it's a word of comfort that me as a pastor, I've never lost a child, so I don't know what that's like. But someone who could come alongside and say, I know what that's like. I know what you're going through. I never would have made it if I didn't have Jesus that I could go to. It may be in those moments of vulnerability that our faith speaks the loudest. Very few people are ever going to be convinced to seek God because of a theological lecture. Just rarely happen. Maybe there's one or two super rational people who are become intellectually convinced of the claims of Christ and decide, okay, then I'll put my faith in him. I've never had that experience. My experience is that in the depth of despair, people reach out their hand. And if God's strong hand reaches down and grabs their hand, then they're willing to follow with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. Next week, we're going to talk about how to write down your faith story. And I would encourage you not only to write it down, but consider at some point sitting down with someone who can just take out an iPhone and record you reading your faith story, because that could be a legacy to people in your family. There's something about a video that allows people, or the spoken word that allows people to really connect. And I'm sure that there are people around the church who can help you do that if you don't have the technology to do that. And I want to help you with some ideas of how you begin, what a faith story looks like. This is not the same thing as a life story. I always encourage people to keep their faith story to 10 minutes if they can, to cut out the superfluous stuff because we get tired. And so tell a short story, make the main thing the main thing. So we'll talk about that next week. Meanwhile, I hope you have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.